the climate Silk Road, trade, diplomacy and the low carbon transition. Trade, geopolitics and COP processes are tidal forces, aren't they, underpinning the transition to the future low carbon economy. So who are the most significant global players today in climate policy, sustainable finance and technological innovation? And what are their responsibilities and how do they impact system level change? Well, as repeated calls are made to honour and implement rapidly encroaching 2030 goals, what are the main hurdles yet to be overcome? Let's now speak to thought leaders about the cross-sector and cross-stakeholder collaboration required to phase out fossil fuels and guarantee consumer confidence and prosperity, whilst also that vital seismic change that takes place. Let's give a warm welcome now to Director of Economics Climate Champions Team and Senior Fellow, World Resources Institute, Simon Sharp, alongside author and Executive Chair, Sandrine Dixon de Clèves. Welcome. Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed for joining us on the main stage. So much to talk about. I do want at some point to include some questions from the audience if we have time. But Simon, the world order has shifted, hasn't it? I mean, really radically. The implications are really quite dramatic. But put the context for us with the US and where we're going from across the pond.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Is that sounding all right?
I don't know if you can hear, Sam. You can indeed. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think everybody will have seen all of the news reports coming out of the US, and in terms of what the government's doing, it's about as bad as it could be. It's not only unpicking the regulations and the investment policies that would help move the transition forward, it's also actively trying to push things backwards. One of the most staggering measures was trying to lift the air pollution restrictions on coal plants to encourage more coal plants to be built. So they're actually trying to promote dirty air and dirty water that will be harmful to the health of people in America. That couldn't be worse. However, if you look at the record of the last time Trump was in power in America, more coal power plants closed under him than they did under Barack Obama. And if you look at the forecast for this year, it's for over 90% of new power capacity in America to come from solar and wind. So he's actually fighting against the tide. He's the King Canute of the energy transition, and he's definitely not going to win.
So you set the context of Trump's agenda, but what can we do, if anything?
Well, it depends who we are, of course. And I think if you're in the US, then it's absolutely about working with the interests that there are. The consumers that want lower energy bills, everybody who wants energy security, industry that wants to be competitive in the technologies of the future. And it was only a few months ago that a group of 21 Republican members of the House of Congress wrote a letter asking to keep the Biden-era clean energy subsidies for all of those reasons. So you have to work with those interests. If you're outside the US, then you've got to make life difficult for them unless they come along with the transition. And I think the most important thing of all is for Europe to work with China and create the conditions where, for access to both of our markets, American firms need to be producing clean technologies.
Sandrine, let's bring you in. How can climate change diplomacy be made more effective? Because that's clearly the ultimate goal.
Absolutely, and what I would say is I think we've lost sight of real climate change diplomacy. In fact, Simon and I were talking about what led to the Paris Agreement was months of hard work, both by the UK and by France, of working with their embassies, of working with different countries to build the Paris Agreement. What we've seen in the last 3 presidencies is a shift away from that, a shift away from really building up not only, by the way, the diplomatic conversations, but thinking through the interlinkages with trade, thinking through the interlinkages with non-state actors, for example, which is why the champions are so important. I want to inject a little bit of hope here at this very dire time, which is that Mark Carney has just been elected. Let's bring that in, because Carney, we've just found ourselves another government that is absolutely going to be a champion. Now, some of us are talking about New York Climate Week going to Montreal to demonstrate that actually in solidarity, we have new actors that are coming to the plate that can shake things up. I'm not undermining or poo-pooing what's happening in the United States. It is dire. But this is a moment where the BRICS can come together with the EU, can come together with Canada, and think through new trade agreements, new climate diplomacy, which focuses on implementation, which ensures that we drive change towards 2030, and which ensures that when we talk about innovation zero, we are looking at the feedback loops between poverty, inequality, biodiversity loss, and climate. Because what came out of our book, Earth for All, A Survival Guide for Humanity, was very clear with Johan Rockström and other economists, was that the speed and scale of decarbonization will actually not be possible unless we look at poverty alleviation. And Lula is very much, and this is the new climate diplomacy, thinking through what are the social tipping points alongside the environmental tipping points. How can we actually bring in a shift and innovation which enables us to both eradicate poverty and inequality whilst decoupling our emissions and moving towards our decarbonization goals?
Nevertheless, what we are looking to do has never been done before. It is going to be extremely difficult. Which countries do you think then are most likely to advance that global transition? Which countries are likely to be the biggest collaborators?
I fundamentally believe that Lula and Brazil, working with South Africa, China, India, so through the BRICS, but also working with the European Union, working with the UK, working with Canada, can really unlock this time into a time of greatness. This is when we need to stand up to the plate. Again, Simon and I were speaking, and I've been speaking with others this morning. We've had the spring meetings in Washington, and the denialism of what the US is doing, whether it be USAID, whether it be the pullout of most of our aid funding, is really a fundamental problem. This is about a shift amongst the Bretton Woods institutions. This is about understanding that we need to do things differently. This is also the time when the BRICS and the most vulnerable nations must come together and think through, and that's why me and Motley's efforts at Bridgetown are so important. What if we started to look at debt cancellation or debt for nature swaps? What if we started to look at new mechanisms, putting a value on natural resources in our accounting and our budgets, looking at beyond growth and new indicators, which is exactly what we're starting to do at the UN level, but also at different country levels.
Simon, would you agree with that?
Yeah, hugely. I think we desperately need institutional reform in climate change diplomacy. For the last 30 years, we've had this approach within the United Nations of consensus and universal participation. What happens when you do that is the best you can have is norm setting. So we've all agreed, let's do something about climate change. We've all agreed, let's aim for a global net zero. Then we start putting that in national goals. Those are good things. They make the direction clear, but they don't actually get the job done. So to complement that, you need some serious collaboration in each of the emitting sectors, which are each very different from each other. And I very much agree with what Sandrine was saying about the countries that are crucial in that. What you can add to that is they're primarily the net fossil fuel importer countries. Europe, China, India, those are big net importers, and it's absolutely in their interest to stop paying other countries like Russia or the Middle Eastern countries huge amounts of money to import fossil fuels. So that's one of the main interests driving the transition, and those countries can work together quite seriously.
Okay, thank you. Sandrine, you recently wrote a letter, didn't you, an open letter to the UNFCCC calling for COPs to deliver. Have you had a response to your letter?
Absolutely. So actually this letter was about COP reform. But it was written out of 3 years of frustration where myself, Johan Rockström, have been actually commenting, both coming out of Sharm el-Sheikh, at the issues that we saw, human rights violations, the fact that there were more badges that were given to fossil fuel energy producers, as we were just talking about, rather than scientists. And so this push started the first COP reform letter. Then we went into Dubai, and we saw that there was a total denialism around the link between emissions and fossil emissions and energy. And that created also another letter of scientists, which we brought together to really protest this fact, but also to bring science back to the negotiations. Do you know that scientists are the least represented within the negotiations in comparison to incumbents and lobbyists? What happened is when the Azerbaijan president opened up the Baku COP and indicated that fossil energy was God's gift to the world, that was the call to say enough. And so we released our letter with Christiana Figueres and Ban Ki-moon and Mary Robinson and other dignitaries, but also scientists, and this was a joint letter, it wasn't just mine. And we very much indicated that we needed to rethink the purpose of the COPs if we were going to actually start to hit our net zero targets. We needed to make the COPs smaller because we were hitting up to 90,000 participants, 100,000 participants. And by the way, Brazil has very much been talking about this because there's no way they can encompass so many people in Belém. But most importantly, that this diplomatic pre-diplomacy needed to be undertaken again, that we needed to bring in non-state actors as real viable actors for change, that those presidencies, first of all, that were not pushing a shift away from fossil energy, but also those actors that were not doing the same, should not be let in. That we should have a very clear criteria for the types also of presidencies that lead the COPs, and that finally we enable and ensure real progress. And if this takes smaller meetings leading up to the COPs, then so be it. It shouldn't just be 1-2 week moment in time. And that's very much what we asked for. And sorry, I forgot to say, and yes, since then, I was just with Simon Steele at Change Now in Paris just last week. There is a great deal of interest and discussion and real desire to set up a process of understanding where are the necessary reforms, where can we more work together, where can we also ensure that the most vulnerable states are represented, and that is an ongoing conversation, and I think one that is being taken very seriously.
Okay, so the letter was worth writing, and you're feeling quite
Absolutely.
optimistic about some of the solutions that have come out of it?
Yes, yes, absolutely. I do think that we are at a difficult time. I mean, let us be honest about the pushback that we're seeing, both in terms of many countries and companies that are pushing away from net zero. But as I said in the beginning, I think this is a moment to come together and realize that we cannot just be dependent on the US, whether they are in or out, that it is our time, as a collective different types of companies, different types of organizations, different types of radical new partnerships, but also new governments who are coming forward and saying, we will assume the responsibility to ensure that we continue to move towards net zero.
Okay, Simon, let's talk about China, shall we? They're leading in low carbon, aren't they? But at the same time, they're also increasing coal power. How do you interpret their path?
So it sounds very contradictory, but I think the direction of travel for China is incredibly clear. Last year, China's investment in clean energy was almost equal to the total whole world investment in fossil fuels. They just met their 2030 target for renewable power 6 years early. Their electric vehicle share of car sales has overtaken that of Europe and America. I think they're even ahead of California now. And they're way ahead of Europe and America in terms of electrification of industry. So yes, they're still building coal plants, which is not a good idea. Why is that happening? Well, mostly because the individual Chinese provinces are still worried about their energy security, and they overcompensate by building a lot of coal plants. But those plants are being used less and less, and the coal share of generation in power in China is falling. So we shouldn't extrapolate too much from that particular trend. I think what is so important, and I've mentioned it already, is the need for Europe and other countries like Sandrine said, Brazil as well, to work with China. I think there's often a mistake, I've seen this firsthand, in diplomacy that starts from Europe, where we go and talk to our friends first. We say, okay, we're the Brits, let's go and talk to the French, then let's go and talk to the Americans when they have a sensible government, and let's talk to the Canadians, and we'll all group together as our friends first, agree what we want to do, and then we'll invite in China, or actually no, we'll probably go for India first because they speak our language, then we'll think about China. By the time you get around to China, they go, hey, you cooked this up with no input from us, we're not interested. And that's entirely the wrong approach, because China is so overwhelmingly powerful and influential in this transition. If you look at the steel sector, China is half of global production and half of global consumption. We're not going to decarbonize steel without China. China's making 3/4 of the world's electric vehicles. We're not going to make good electric vehicles unless we join up with the Chinese and get co-investment in manufacturing here, probably. And so we need to go to the Chinese first. And this is what I've said to the Brazilians, who are now, as Sandrine mentioned, chairing the UN climate talks this year. I said, look, go to Beijing first, agree with the Chinese what the practical approach to working together for system change in the global economy is going to be, then come to the Europeans, and don't worry, we'll get on board. If you and the Chinese are working together, we are with you, and you'll find the same with other countries too. So we need to reorientate the way we approach climate diplomacy.
So what is your challenge then? Does industrial trade need to be completely, or sorry, international trade need to be completely restructured in your view?
Well, if you think about it, let's take steel for example. At the moment, to the best of our knowledge, the low carbon, zero emission methods of producing steel will be more expensive than the high fossil fuel emissions ways of doing it. Now, steel is competitive international trade. So just think about the end point. How are we going to get zero emissions in the steel sector globally? Well, you would have to have trade rules that say you can only buy or sell zero emission steel. That has to be your end point. So how do you get towards that? Well, you have to have a negotiation about trade. In my view, that started from the wrong point. The wrong starting point is saying, let's tax the old thing. Let's all try and agree carbon pricing. We'll never be able to do that. There's no transition in the past. By the way, we have done this before. Lots of technology transitions in the past. None of them happened because you taxed the old thing. You know, we didn't do horses to cars because we taxed horse shit. We didn't do letter writing to the internet because we taxed letter writing. It all happens because you invest in the new. Now, if you base your trade diplomacy around taxing the old, what do you find? Well, our existing steel plants are all very different. If you've got lots of scrap recycling plants in the US compared to lots of blast furnaces in India, then a common carbon price will have completely different effects in those two countries. Radically unfair. You'll never be able to agree that. Whereas what if you say, let's have a tariff exemption for clean steel?
Exactly.
Well, nobody's producing any of that at the moment. Completely equal starting point. You're running a race, you're firing the starting gun, you're starting from the same point. Why not? That, I think, is a lot more feasible, and that's where the diplomacy needs to focus.
Sandrine, you're nodding your head.
Yeah, I am, because clearly a tariff war starts a reverberation of more tariff wars. And we need to get behind and take a step back and really think through what are the new types of economic spaces that we want to create to enhance the transfer of technology, but also the transition. And I can give a very clear example of, for example, shifting from dirty fuels to clean fuels, as I wrote the directive on clean fuels and vehicle emissions. And exactly as Simon said, we didn't go ahead and tax the dirty fuel, but what we did do is we incentivized the clean fuel. We made the clean fuel actually the same price as the dirty fuel. And what happened was there was an immediate transition towards the clean fuel. In fact, what slowly started to happen is that we saw that the penetration of cleaner fuels took over the dirty fuel. And I think it's important that we realize that we have to build the plane as we fly it. So we will have to have two synonymous economic systems going at the same time. But we need to figure out what are the key levers to jump to that other system. And one of the things that troubles me often when we talk at decarbonization conference and meeting net zero is that we forget about the perversities in our market. We forget that we actually have 2.8 billion windfall profits per day by fossil energy companies, and we're not taxing those profits. That in and of itself could become the largest just transition fund. We continue to subsidize fossil energy rather than enable a shift. So there are ways in which we can reduce the perversities within our market to actually give the right value on that shift. And let us remember the last thing, and Rachel actually reminded us of this from Lord Stern's report, but I want to bring it in because I think that we are losing sight of the fact that we will lose at 1.5 degrees, and we are already here at 1.5 average this year, 3% GDP. At 3 degrees, we risk losing upwards of 10% GDP in the global north and 17% in the most vulnerable countries. So we have no choice to think through what are the new mechanisms from an economic perspective of transitioning to the economy that is not just bringing in new technologies, but actually enabling us to thrive, not just survive.
Okay, as we reach the end of our time together, Simon, if you could end by giving us your thoughts on the role of the individual versus business in achieving global system climate change.
Oh yeah, sure. I have a principle for this, which is it's not about your footprint. It's about your point of leverage. Why is it not about your footprint? Well, actually, before I say why it's not, let's just remember, who was it that most vigorously promoted the idea of the carbon footprint in this country? It was BP.
Exactly.
Why would they do that? Well, for the same reason that car companies 100 years ago promoted PR campaigns on how to be a safe pedestrian. It puts the burden on you, the individual, to try and solve a problem which is a systemic problem. It distracts attention from system change. And by the way, there's a limit to what you can do. I'm not saying don't try and reduce your footprint. Of course, if you want to, go for it. It's a good thing to do. But I'm not Greta Thunberg or the Pope. I'm not going to pretend that's my point of leverage, setting a great example. Absolutely not. But there's a study by MIT scientists in the US that said if you're a homeless person in the US living on soup kitchens, you still have an unsustainably high carbon footprint. So that is not the thing to focus on. Focus on your point of leverage, which is what can you do better than most can do to contribute to system change. And one of my favorite examples of technology transitions from the past that I think helps to illustrate this comes from the work of Frank Heels, a Dutch academic. The transition in the Netherlands from open sewer systems and shit in the streets, not to put too fine a point on it, towards clean water infrastructure. Well, look who helped make that happen. It was doctors that connected open sewers to cholera outbreaks. It was engineers who showed how you could build good pipelines. It was city governments that experimented with the first small water infrastructure networks. It was businesses on the buying side, like breweries, that said, actually, we'd quite like to have clean water to put in our beer, and paper makers and others. And eventually it was national governments that said, this is a good thing, we're going to extend these infrastructure networks to the whole country. That's how you do a transition. Everybody does their bit. That's the way to think about the low carbon transition, whether you're an individual or a business or even in fact a country.
Thank you very much indeed for challenging our thinking there. It's not about our carbon footprint, it's about focusing on system change. No doubt, Sandrine, you agree.
I completely agree. And I would even add that we are at a moment where we are losing sight of our collective responsibility within the different systems that we are part of, the economic system, the financial system. Our economic system has been over-financialized and predominantly focused on shareholder value. Now, why is this important? Because this transition will remind us that it's not just about profit motives. And we do need to stop thinking that this is going to be a huge financial bonanza. Yes, there is money to be made, but this is a broader vision. This is a broader vision about our survival and how we ensure that this is no longer the greatest existential threat to humanity. So we need to think about new types of shareholder value, collective shareholder value. We need to think about the fact that actually, if we're going to make it now in a just transition, we need to bring justice back in. So I think it's very important to actually embolden ourselves within this. And I so agree with Simon, it's not just about the way in which we look at our individual footprint. It's the way we vote. It's the way we decide and hold our governments accountable. It's the way we hold our businesses accountable. And I think at the end of the day, as Sharon Burrows, who was the head of the International Union Confederation, said, you know, there are no jobs on a dead planet. There are no stocks, there are no bonds, there's no money making on a dead planet. So let's just make sure we don't get to that. Thank you.
Simon and Sandrine, let's give them a huge round of applause. You've certainly changed the way that I think, so I'm sure you've impacted our audience as well. Thank you so much.